Dawn broke on June 6, 1944, with the skies above Normandy streaked in gray mist and smoke. The sea churned with landing craft as the first waves of Allied soldiers closed in on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. From the cliffs and bunkers above, German artillery and machine guns thundered, tearing into the ranks of men struggling ashore. Amid this storm of fire, not only infantry advanced, but engineers, burdened with explosives, mine detectors, and demolition tools. Their task was as clear as it was deadly: clear paths through the obstacles that littered the beaches, or watch the invasion collapse in chaos. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with mines, and webs of barbed wire turned the shoreline into a killing ground. For the U.S. Army's engineer combat battalions, each obstacle was a death sentence waiting to detonate. They carried Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes packed with explosives, and sprinted across open sand to jam them under wire entanglements. As the charges blew, gaps opened briefly in the defenses. But every second of work was done under the whine of mortars and the merciless chatter of MG-42 machine guns. One engineer later recalled that the water around him boiled red before he had cleared his first lane. At Omaha Beach, the price was horrific. Many engineer units suffered casualties exceeding 50% within the opening hour. Demolition teams tried again and again to blast channels through obstacles, only to be cut down as they placed their charges. Others crawled forward dragging heavy satchel explosives, laying them against steel beams while bullets snapped into the sand around them. Some never rose again. Yet in the face of near-certain death, others completed their missions, opening narrow corridors for infantry and tanks pressing in from the surf. The smell of cordite and seawater mingled with smoke, creating a suffocating haze over the shoreline. Engineers shouted over the din of battle, coordinating teams of survivors, gathering whatever explosives remained from fallen comrades. Corpses lay tangled in wire, but still the work continued. Naval gunfire rumbled overhead, shaking the earth, but it could not suppress the German defenders entrenched in concrete pillboxes. In places, the engineers had to use flamethrowers, sending sheets of fire across bunkers before they could resume clearing obstacles. Elsewhere on Utah Beach, the engineers met less resistance but faced the same cruel hazards. Landing craft often veered off course in the currents, leaving men to struggle across sandbars and mudflats weighted down with 50 pounds of gear. Mines detonated beneath their boots. Still, teams marked safe lanes with colored tape or flags, directing follow-on forces through the breaches. The difference between success and disaster often came down to a few feet of cleared sand. Behind them, waves of infantry waited, pinned down by fire, unable to advance without the engineers' work. On D-Day, the combat engineers became the spear point of the invasion, shouldering tasks that determined whether thousands more could even reach the fight. Their sacrifice was not measured in grand maneuvers, but in every foot of wire cut, every obstacle blown, every lane carved under fire. By midday, enough passages had been forced open for tanks and men to push off the killing sands and toward the bluffs. The cost was staggering, but the bridgehead had been won. For many engineers, the battle ended where it began, on the beach, among the twisted wreckage of their charges and the bodies of their comrades. For the survivors, the memory of that morning never faded. The invasion of Normandy is remembered for the infantry who stormed the sands and the paratroopers who dropped from the skies. But hidden in the smoke and surf was another story: the engineers whose tools were as vital as rifles, whose courage built the very path to victory. On June 6, 1944, they fought not only the enemy before them, but the very landscape itself, turning a fortress coast into a gateway for liberation. Their struggle, overshadowed in memory, was the foundation of D-Day's success, a battle not just fought, but built in fire on the beaches. The victory on the beaches of Normandy was not born in a single day. It was the culmination of years of preparation, lessons learned in failure, and innovations that pushed the limits of engineering and logistics. To understand the hidden struggle of D-Day's engineers, one must first look back to the long road that led there. After France fell in 1940, the English Channel became both a moat and a wall. Across its waters, Adolf Hitler's forces fortified the western coast of Europe with the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile chain of bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacles meant to repel any Allied assault. The disastrous raid on Dieppe in August 1942 offered a brutal lesson. Canadian troops, supported by tanks and engineers, had stormed the French port, only to be slaughtered by entrenched defenders. Nearly 60% of the raiding force was killed, wounded, or captured. Engineers who tried to clear the beach obstacles were cut down almost instantly. The raid's failure hammered home a chilling truth. No invasion of France could succeed without unprecedented levels of planning, coordination, and engineering innovation. From that moment onward, engineering became the backbone of Allied strategy. Britain transformed into a colossal staging ground for invasion. Its ports teemed with landing ship, tanks, the ungainly LSTs capable of disgorging vehicles directly onto beaches. Shipyards along the Clyde and Thames worked around the clock to produce floating pontoons, modular causeways, and prefabricated harbors. Known as mulberries, these artificial ports would allow Allied forces to unload supplies at Normandy's beaches even without capturing a major French port in the opening days. The scale of preparation bordered on the unimaginable. By mid-1944, Britain was hosting over 2 million Allied troops. Warehouses and airfields spilled over with supplies, thousands of tanks, jeeps, artillery pieces, and millions of tons of ammunition. But beneath this spectacle of force lay the quiet labor of engineers. They tested soil samples from potential landing sites, calculating whether the beaches could support tanks without swallowing them whole. They studied tidal charts and weather patterns, noting how shifting sands might bury mines or expose obstacles. They rehearsed demolitions in remote Scottish bays, perfecting the use of Bangalore torpedoes and explosives to clear wire, stakes, and steel barriers. Every contingency was examined. What if German defenders flooded low-lying areas? What if the tides left landing craft stranded? To counter these threats, engineers designed amphibious innovations, Sherman tanks equipped with flotation skirts, amphibious trucks known as dukus, and bridging equipment to cross rivers and flooded terrain. Some of these creations were ungainly and risky, but in war, improvisation became necessity. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, General Dwight D. Eisenhower relied heavily on engineering reports to choose Normandy as the invasion site. The beaches of Calais were closer and more heavily fortified, but Normandy's coastline offered longer stretches of sand and weaker fortifications. Still, the risk was enormous. German defenses at Omaha and other beaches bristled with steel hedgehogs, mines, and gun emplacements. Eisenhower knew success depended on engineers clearing lanes under fire, and on the artificial harbors that would keep the invasion supplied once ashore. By early 1944, the staging areas in southern England had become scenes of ceaseless rehearsals. Soldiers trained with mock minefields, detonating charges while smoke and debris filled the air. Amphibious engineers practiced loading and unloading vehicles onto causeways, simulating what awaited them in France. For months, secrecy cloaked the preparations, but the scale was impossible to hide. Across the English countryside, villagers watched convoys of tanks rumble past, while skies overhead roared with the sound of sea, 47 transports and gliders rehearsing airborne drops. For the engineers, the months before D-Day were as much a test of endurance as of skill. They labored in mud, wind, and rain, refining demolitions, building mock seawalls, and drilling with explosives until every action became instinct. Many knew their survival on invasion day depended on speed, clearing an obstacle in seconds instead of minutes, cutting a gap before the next burst of machine gun fire. By the spring of 1944, the greatest invasion force in history stood ready. Yet even then, doubts lingered. Memories of Dieppe haunted commanders, and engineers understood that their role on June 6th would be decisive. If they failed to clear the beaches, the invasion might collapse before it began. Thus, the road to invasion was paved not only with tanks and ships, but with blueprints, calculations, and rehearsals. It was built in workshops where welders shaped steel for floating harbors, in classrooms where engineers studied tidal ranges, and in muddy fields where men practiced with explosives again and again. When dawn broke over Normandy, the engineers carried not only their tools but the weight of years of preparation. The fate of Operation Overlord and the liberation of Europe would rest in no small part on their shoulders. The invasion of Normandy was not won by courage alone. Behind the men who stormed the beaches stood an arsenal unlike anything the world had ever seen. The combined ingenuity of Allied engineers and the industrial might of two continents. In Britain, workshops and factories buzzed with experimentation. Out of this crucible of necessity emerged Hobart's Funnies, a collection of armored engineering vehicles conceived by Major General Percy Hobart. Where infantry saw obstacles, Hobart saw problems to be solved with steel and firepower. There were flail tanks, their spinning chains hammering the ground to detonate mines. The AVREs, modified Churchill tanks carrying petard mortars capable of blasting bunkers to rubble, and bridging tanks, which carried their own mobile ramps to span ditches and seawalls. To those who witnessed them in training, the machines looked ungainly, even absurd. Yet on the battlefields of June 6th, these innovations would save countless lives. Across the Atlantic, American shipyards hummed day and night. Production lines along the coasts of New Orleans, Mobile, and Pittsburgh churned out thousands of landing craft. Among them were the ubiquitous Higgins boats, with their distinctive bow ramps, designed to deliver squads of infantry directly onto hostile sand. Larger vessels, LSTs, or landing ship, tank, carried entire columns of vehicles, disgorging Shermans and half-tracks onto shorelines. By 1944, the United States had produced more than 6,000 landing craft, their steel hulls riveted by men and women working 12-hour shifts under the din of pounding hammers. Bridges, too, became weapons of war. The Bailey Bridge, a prefabricated marvel of British engineering, could be assembled by hand without cranes and carried heavy armor across rivers within hours. Modular pontoons extended into the sea, forming temporary causeways for unloading men and supplies. These inventions turned beaches into arteries of advance, ensuring that the invasion would not stall once the first waves had landed. Perhaps the most ambitious engineering feat of all was the Mulberry Harbor. Conceived in secrecy, these artificial ports consisted of massive concrete caissons, known as Phoenix units, which could be towed across the channel and sunk to create breakwaters. Floating roadways, nicknamed whales, linked the harbors to shore. To outside eyes, the concept bordered on madness, constructing entire ports on the open sea. Yet by June 1944, Britain had prepared 2 Mulberries, vast enough to handle thousands of tons of supplies each day. The statistics of this preparation tell their own story. By the eve of D-Day, Allied factories had produced over 4,000 landing ships, 200 miles of floating roadway, and nearly 2.5 million men trained in amphibious operations. Tens of thousands of engineers drilled in demolitions, bridge building, and obstacle clearance. A British officer later recalled walking along a dockyard crowded with Mulberry components. It was as if a city was waiting offshore, ready to sail. The sight of these creations inspired awe among the soldiers who would use them. A U.S. sergeant remembered watching Hobart's Funnies in demonstration. The ground shook with every blast, and the tanks seemed to turn beach defenses into matchsticks. We knew then this invasion would not be another Dieppe. For many infantrymen, the arsenal of invasion was more than steel. It was a promise that someone had thought of the obstacles ahead and built a way through. This marriage of imagination and industry was no accident. It reflected a new kind of warfare, where victory depended as much on factories, draftsmen, and welders as on rifles and bayonets. The Allies had harnessed science and production on a colossal scale, creating tools that gave their engineers a fighting chance against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. As the final weeks before June 6th approached, the beaches of southern England grew crowded with strange shapes. Rows of tanks with canvas flotation skirts, lines of amphibious trucks, barges loaded with steel pontoons. Soldiers stared in wonder, realizing they were about to take part in an invasion unlike any in history. The arsenal was ready. Now, the engineers would have to wield it under fire. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the tide rose with the sound of gunfire. Off the coast of Normandy, the sea boiled with landing craft pushing through smoke and surf. For the engineers tasked with clearing the beaches, it was not only an invasion, it was a death sentence carried out under machine gun fire. At Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of them all, engineer combat battalions leapt from their Higgins boats burdened with packs of explosives, Bangalore torpedoes, and wire cutters. Ahead of them lay the Atlantic Wall, steel hedgehogs, timber stakes rigged with mines, barbed wire strung thick across the sand. Above them, German MG-42s barked from fortified bunkers carved into the bluffs. The first waves were cut down mercilessly. Men waded chest-deep through surf that ran red, their demolition charges sinking into the tide as comrades collapsed beside them. One engineer later recalled, "The water was red before we cleared a single path. We had no cover, no time. We just worked." In that first hour, some units lost more than half their strength. Torpedoes meant to blast gaps in wire were often detonated prematurely by enemy fire, killing the very men who carried them. Yet others pressed on, crawling forward under sheets of bullets, laying charges with shaking hands before retreating seconds ahead of the blast. The chaos was total. Smoke from burning landing craft mingled with sea spray. Sand was torn apart by mortar bursts. Still, through grit and sacrifice, gaps began to appear. Narrow lanes, scarcely wider than a tank tread, opened through the obstacles. It was enough for infantry and armor to claw their way inland, though the cost was staggering. Without the engineers' sacrifice, Omaha might well have collapsed into disaster. At Utah Beach, conditions were less dire, but no less demanding. Strong currents had pushed the landing force a mile south of its intended target, a mistake that turned into fortune. Here, German defenses were lighter. Engineers scrambled ashore and began clearing obstacles with greater speed, blasting open routes with Bangalore torpedoes and cutting through wire. Losses came, but not in the catastrophic numbers of Omaha. By mid-morning, tanks and trucks were streaming through lanes the engineers had carved in the sand. Farther east, British and Canadian forces faced their own crucibles at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Their engineers, supported by Hobart's funnies, demonstrated the power of innovation under fire. Flail tanks whipped chains across the beaches, detonating mines with terrifying concussions. AVREs rolled forward, hurling mortar rounds into bunkers that had withstood naval bombardment. On Juno Beach, engineers followed behind these machines, marking cleared lanes with white tape for infantry to advance. At Gold and Sword, they used bridging tanks to cross seawalls and seawater-filled craters, transforming the impossible into the achievable. Everywhere, the story was the same. Engineers fighting their own war within the invasion. They were not shielded by distance or artillery. They fought at the very front, their tools as vital as rifles. A British sapper later wrote in his diary, "We were expected to work while standing in the open. Men fell beside us, but the wire had to be cut, the charges placed. There was no choice." By the afternoon, enough paths had been forced open across the beaches for the invasion to gain traction. Infantry surged through, tanks clawed their way forward, and the beachheads began to link. But the victory had been purchased with terrible loss. On Omaha alone, engineer battalions recorded casualties rivaling those of the infantry they supported. Their war was fought not in trenches or fields, but on bare sand under direct fire, with no cover but courage. As the sun set on June 6th, smoke still drifted across the Normandy coast. The beaches were scarred with craters, littered with wrecked landing craft, twisted obstacles, and the bodies of the fallen. Yet against the most formidable defenses in Europe, the engineers had carved the openings that made victory possible. The invasion had survived its most dangerous day. Ahead lay the breakout into Normandy's bocage, where engineers would again be called upon to bridge rivers, clear mines, and blast through hedgerows. But the storm on the beaches had proven one truth. Without the engineers' sacrifice, D-Day would not have succeeded. Securing the beaches of Normandy was only the first step. The true test came in the days and weeks that followed, when the survival of the Allied foothold hinged not on gunfire, but on supply. Armies could not fight without food, fuel, and ammunition. Without a steady lifeline across the channel, the invasion itself risked collapse. It fell to the engineers to build that lifeline in the face of storms, enemy fire, and exhaustion. The answer was as bold as the landings themselves, the Mulberry Harbors. Conceived in secrecy before D-Day, these vast artificial ports were built in pieces across Britain. Concrete caissons as large as apartment blocks, floating roadways, and steel piers. On June 7th, as the beaches filled with men and machines, the first components were towed across the channel and sunk into place. Within days, Mulberry Beach at Arromanches became a floating city of steel and concrete, capable of unloading 7,000 tons of supplies a day. But the sea was merciless. On June 19th, a violent storm lashed the coast. Mulberry, off Omaha Beach, was torn apart and rendered useless. For a moment, disaster loomed. Yet the engineers adapted. They reinforced Mulberry Beach, improvised pontoon causeways, and increased direct unloading on the beaches themselves. Their ingenuity ensured the lifeline held. Day and night, engineers labored in punishing conditions. Pontoon causeways were extended hundreds of yards into the surf, allowing trucks and tanks to drive directly from ship to shore. Damaged landing zones were repaired under enemy shellfire. German artillery occasionally found its mark, sending showers of shrapnel across men already wearied from endless shifts. One engineer wrote bitterly in his diary, "Sleep came only when the work was finished, and the work was never finished." Inland, another kind of engineering war was being fought. As Allied forces pushed beyond the beaches into the bocage, every river, stream, and crater became a potential barrier. Bailey bridges, modular steel structures designed in Britain, became the backbone of the advance. Carried in prefabricated sections, they could be erected in hours, strong enough to carry tanks and convoys. Across Normandy's rivers and marshes, Bailey bridges multiplied, each one a silent testament to engineering brilliance. Every bridge mattered, for German counterattacks were fierce. Panzers sought to drive wedges into the fragile Allied lines, hoping to cut supply and force a retreat into the sea. But wherever German armor advanced, engineers worked to keep roads and crossings open, often repairing under fire. One sapper recalled working through the night to lay bridging while shells fell nearby, the glow of burning villages lighting the sky. "We kept building," he said later. "If we stopped, the front stopped." By July, the logistical miracle was evident. Mountains of ammunition, fuel, and rations flowed steadily from Britain into France. More than 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles would eventually cross using the system the engineers had sustained. Mulberry Beach, despite the storm, continued to operate for months, its floating roadways flexing with the tide like the arteries of a living organism. The success of the invasion was not measured only in battles won, but in supplies delivered. The engineers had transformed bare beaches into gateways for armies, turning the tide of war through endurance as much as through invention. Their struggle was quieter than the clash of infantry and armor, but without it, the Allied foothold would have withered. As the Normandy campaign deepened, the lesson was clear. The courage that stormed the beaches had to be matched by the determination that sustained them. And it was the engineers who carried that burden, building under fire, bridging every gap, and holding open the lifeline that made victory possible. As the smoke of the beach landings cleared and Allied forces pressed inland, a new struggle began, one that was less visible than the assaults on Omaha or the parachute drops behind enemy lines, but no less vital. The combat engineers, already bloodied on D-Day, now found themselves in a campaign of relentless labor and constant danger. Their tools were shovels, explosives, and timber. Their battlefield was every hedgerow, road, and river that lay between Normandy and Germany. The Norman countryside was a maze of bocage, ancient hedgerows reinforced with earthen banks and thick roots, some standing taller than a man. For infantry, these hedgerows offered concealment but slowed every advance. For tanks, they were deadly traps, exposing vehicles as they tried to cross. It was the engineers who devised solutions, welding steel blades onto the front of Sherman tanks to carve breaches. Others crawled forward with explosives under rifle fire, blasting narrow lanes so infantry could move without bottlenecking. Each success was paid for in blood. Bridges posed another constant challenge. Retreating German units systematically demolished every crossing they left behind, hoping to stall the Allied advance. Engineers rushed forward to rebuild, often under shell fire. Bailey bridges became their answer, modular steel spans that could be erected in hours, sometimes in darkness, sometimes with artillery crashing nearby. A British officer later remarked that the Bailey Bridge was worth more to us than the atom bomb was to the Americans. For the men assembling them, however, the task was no miracle. It was backbreaking labor performed with the knowledge that one misstep could bring German shells down on the site. Engineers rarely worked far from danger. In many cases, their tasks put them closer to the enemy than infantry themselves. Clearing mines required men to probe the soil with bayonets or their bare hands, inching forward while machine guns raked the fields. One American engineer later recalled in his diary, "We dug and wired while bullets cracked overhead. It was soldiers' work and slaves' work all at once." The casualty rates reflected the peril. At Omaha Beach, some engineer battalions had already lost half their men on June 6th. As the fighting moved inland, attrition continued. Engineers doubled as infantry when needed, holding positions or manning machine guns before returning to lay charges or build crossings. This dual burden marked their service, never fully recognized as combat troops, but rarely spared from combat itself. And yet, in the stories of Normandy that followed, their sacrifice often faded into the background. The drama of the paratroopers at Saint-Mère-Église, the heroism of infantry storming the bluffs, and the thunder of tank battles drew the attention of history. The engineers' work was harder to romanticize. Roads repaired in the mud, bridges raised under gray skies, minefields cleared silently in the dawn. Survivors later voiced a quiet resentment. Many felt their role had been invisible, overshadowed by more celebrated arms of service. One British sapper, interviewed decades after the war, admitted, "We built the way forward, but few ever noticed. Our victories were measured in yards of road and tons of supplies, not in medals. Yet without their grit, the advance across France would have slowed to a crawl. Their ingenuity and persistence transformed obstacles into passageways, sustaining the Allied push that ultimately liberated Europe. Their war was one of sweat, exhaustion, and constant exposure to danger. It was a war of bridges across rivers, of lanes cut through hedgerows, and of mines lifted one by one from the soil. And while their stories may not have filled the newspapers of the day, the forgotten sacrifice of the engineers laid the foundation, quite literally, for victory. By the evening of June 7, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secured. The sand, once soaked with blood, now bustled with organized chaos. Convoys of trucks unloading ammunition, bulldozers carving new roads, and cranes lifting supplies onto the shore. The infantry had stormed the defenses, but it was the engineers who kept the victory alive. Without their work, the fragile foothold in France might have crumbled under the weight of German counterattacks. Nearly 3,000 combat engineers were killed or wounded in the invasion. Their mission had been among the most perilous, dismantling obstacles under direct fire, clearing mines in open fields, building bridges with shells bursting overhead. Their labor rarely carried the glory of raising flags or capturing villages, but it carried the weight of the campaign itself. One American engineer later recalled, "We weren't there for medals. We were there to make sure the next wave made it ashore. That was our victory." His words echoed the quiet pride of a corps that understood its role, essential yet often invisible. The engineers' ingenuity was stamped into every mile of the invasion. The Bailey bridges that spanned rivers in days instead of weeks, the pontoon causeways that funneled supplies from ship to shore, and the Mulberry Harbors that became lifelines of the Allied armies. All were born of their skill and sacrifice. They were builders of victory, laying foundations not in peacetime concrete, but in steel and blood. And yet, when the war ended, their story faded behind the larger narratives of airborne troops, infantry assaults, and tank divisions. Engineers were rarely the subjects of films or books. Their tools and bridges did not inspire the same legends as paratroopers at Saint-Mère-Église or rangers scaling Point du Hoc. Still, their impact was undeniable. Without cleared beaches and flowing supply lines, no victory in Normandy could have been sustained. Today, the beaches of Normandy lie quiet. Tourists walk where mines once lurked, and children play where engineers once crawled with torpedoes and wire cutters. From the air, the coastline appears peaceful, a ribbon of sand, the tide rolling in without resistance. Yet beneath that peace lies memory. Here, in the chaos of fire and steel, men labored not only to destroy but to build. The legacy of the combat engineers is not only measured in bridges and ports, but in the survival of the Allied invasion itself. They remind us that wars are won not only by the men who charge, but also by those who clear the path forward. Their sacrifice was not always seen, but it endures in the quiet permanence of a liberated Europe. The film closes with a final image, aerial footage of Normandy's beaches, serene under the evening sun. Where once engineers bled to carve lanes through wire and concrete, now stands a monument of silence. The message lingers. D-Day was not won by infantry alone. It was also won by those who built under fire, who turned chaos into order, and who left behind the enduring legacy of victory built from steel, timber, and sacrifice.